Whenever you're ready.
Oh, in vitro fertilization. So our topic for today is whether or not in vitro fertilization should be offered to couples who don't suffer from infertility.
So here are some infertility statistics in the United States, and one of the biggest ones that might surprise people is that 11% of couples struggle with infertility. Men are about 1/3 of the percent, women are about 1/3, and then the last third is from unknown problems.
So many people don't know what IVF is, but IVF is actually an infertility treatment where doctors can extract eggs from a woman and collect sperm from a man. With this, they will manually fertilize the egg in a lab, and then the doctors will transfer the embryo back into a woman's uterus, and finally the baby will develop in the woman's uterus.
Should IVF be offered to couples who don't suffer from infertility? So we think that IVF should be offered to couples who are suffering from infertility. We think that there should be no laws and restrictions should be put in place regarding the age of the couple trying to use this process, and IVF should be available to couples that are associated to single gene mutations.
And while it's easy to see the benefits of IVF, it's important to impose regulation to avoid the abuse of the technology. And we'll go into later about how to avoid sex-linked traits.
So there are several reasons why you should use IVF outside of infertility and several options. These include avoiding fatal genes, an option for same-sex couples, and however designer babies are possibly made from this as well.
So a case of avoiding fatal genes is a case from 2016 where the mother was a carrier for Leigh syndrome. Leigh syndrome is a neurological disorder, and most children with this die within the first 3 years of their life. It's important to note that genes for this syndrome reside in the mitochondria of the woman's cells, but the majority of the DNA resides in the nucleus. Of the woman's DNA resides in the nucleus. So doctors were able to use DNA from the nucleus of a mother and the mitochondrial DNA of a donor egg. This way, they can avoid the fatal gene, as well as the mother will still be biologically related to her child.
So the second option is for same-sex couples. IVF has made it possible for homosexuals to conceive a baby and gives them the option to both be a part of the experience. For lesbian couples, the process is a bit complicated due to some couples wanting one partner to provide the egg and the other to carry the baby. The partner who provides the egg will go through an egg retrieval process. The eggs will be inseminated with the donor sperm and then will be transferred into the other partner's uterus. This process is significantly more expensive due to both partners being involved. For gay couples, the process is a bit different and starts with speaking with their physician to talk about egg donors and gestational carriers. Typically, the couple will decide which partner is providing the sperm, but some decide to both provide and have the embryos chosen at random.
Finally, there is a possibility of a rise of designer babies. With the technology we have now, we can actually make accurate predictions of IQ. Right now, this is only being used to find an IQ low enough to be classified as a disability, but we can see how this could be used to create designer babies that are super smart. Doctors can also screen for over 2,000 diseases, such as Tay-Sachs disease, hemophilia, and susceptibility to certain cancers. Markers that light up red for a Y chromosome and green for an X chromosome can predict gender. Right now, this can be used to avoid sex-linked traits, but you can also see how this can be used to create designer babies with preferred gender. Doctors say soon they'll be able to predict the hair and eye color of the baby.
So in order to determine whether or not IVF should be used outside of couples who suffer from infertility, we must gauge whether or not it should be used at all. And with that, we have some ethical considerations. And most of these emerge if you believe that life begins at conception. So if you're a member of the Roman Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church, who both take up the position that life begins at conception, some of these issues may be an issue for you. So for example, experimentation. So many of the embryos who aren't being used during these infertility treatments are often being used for experiments, in the case of like stem cells, for example. We have the discarding of embryos. So currently there's a massive problem in the United States where because the embryonic failure rate is so high, we're having to create so much more embryos to account for that failure rate, and many of these embryos are being discarded. If you take the point of view that an embryo is a human person, that is tantamount to killing a person. And lastly is designer babies, which we talked about previously, which is that are we discriminating based off of skin color? You know, if we have the ability to choose an embryo, we can see that it is either going to have red or brown hair, or we can test for its IQ or find its diseases. We are discriminating and selecting like subjective traits and viewing one as superior than the other. Those are just some of the ethical issues that we have to take into consideration when dealing whether or not IVF is an ethical practice. And this graph here shows that around 30% of embryos at fertility clinics are abandoned. later discarded. And this is from Dr. Craig Sweet, who operates a fertility clinic in Fort Myers, Florida. And this trend, he says in this NBC article, is going nationwide. That there is a massive crisis currently where embryos are being abandoned and then subsequently discarded because there isn't enough storage space. And if we go to the next slide here, the main issue here is there is like a chronic lack of funding. The government, because there are some ethical considerations, has been less willing to subsidize funding for IVF research. And then according to Suzanne Weimellenberg, a fellow at the National Institute of Medicine, an injection of funding would have three of the following effects. The first would be a higher success rate of IVF cycles. So because there is a higher success rate, that would drive down the need for extra embryos to be created. Secondly is that there would be a decrease in embryonic failure, which again decreases the need for extra embryos. And all of that combines with more efficient infrastructure to accommodate more embryos means that overall there are less embryos being discarded because there are less embryos being created and there's more space to store them, which decreases many of the ethical issues that I talked about before.
So throughout the years, the advancements of IVF have made it possible to create a cheaper, easier, and faster experience for the couple. The first experimentations of IVF date back to 1878 when a Viennese embryologist collected ova from rabbits and guinea pigs and introduced sperm while watching the cell division occur outside of the body. With that milestone, in 1934, scientists and embryologists were able to use the same steps of collecting ova and introducing it to sperm, but instead of watching the cell division occur outside of the body, it was later implanted back into the mammal, which resulted in pregnancy. In 1959, they were able to find that the sperm have to reach a certain phase of maturity before they are ready to fertilize. She was then able to successfully impregnate several rabbits, but years would have to go by before this process was used on humans. Further research was done until about 1978 in England when the first test tube baby was fertilized and transferred into the uterus. On July 25th, 1978, she was born to Leslie and John Brown. About 3 years later, the first IVF baby was born in the United States and 15th worldwide. In 1988, a process to help detect single gene mutations using IVF was successfully used. Preimplantation genetic diagnosis, or PGD, is the screening and identifying of single gene defects. Advancements towards PGD have been slow due to the lack of information and cost. The final data I'll be talking about is the first miracle baby in 2018 to the parents of Bliss and Ashley. Effortless IVF was given to the name of the process that helps homosexual couples have a child, both being part of the experience. The basic parts of IVF are implied, but instead of placing the egg and sperm into an incubator, they are placed into an InvoCell, which is implanted into the uterus for 5 days of fertilization and development. In Bliss and Ashley's case, Bliss carried the InvoCells for 5 days, and then it was later implanted into Ashley's uterus for the rest of the pregnancy. This would be an option for couples that both want to be a part of the experience and has helped over 200 couples today.
Now, as for the scientific part, we also need to look at genetic disorders and how it can prevent that in order to decide if it is allowable for other couples. Now, the most commonly used method of PGD is a process that combines it with assisted fertilization. Now, once fertilized through IVF, the microorganism will develop for 5 to 6 days to reach the blastocyst stage, which is approximately 100 cells development. And the chromosomes are tested for genetic abnormalities with PGD using a biopsy. And that is of a trophidectorum cells. That is a single cell epithelium cell wall which is around the blastocyst. If a genetic abnormality is detected, a different blastocyst will be tested and used until it is no longer found. A popular example of disease prevention using this strategy is with spinal muscular atrophy type 1, in which typically 2 survival motor neuron genes are found in a person. However, if there's a lack of this or lack of survival motor neuron proteins, another embryo will be used and tested, and the baby will be born healthy. And it was found that this had a 93.62 accurate diagnosis rate, which meant that the baby was usually born healthy and without any issues. Furthermore, we can look at designer babies, specifically through germline gene editing, which refers to CRISPR. The term designer baby refers to children who are given traits through genetic engineering. Now, when CRISPR is implemented, CRISPR is a group of deoxyribonucleic acids that is able to harness other genetic material by identifying and destroying other DNA through ribonucleic acid transcription in the human body. The RNA is able to conduct a nuclease, most commonly Cas9, to a specific genetic strand, which can be removed, thus altering the characteristic in the DNA. By using CRISPR-Cas9 in the deletion of a CCR5 gene, for example, China, also found to be documented in several cases of autoimmune diseases and in HIV-1. These children will supposedly be born with higher immunity to HIV-1. While these children have not properly developed yet to test if this was true, they are currently still growing up.
So finally, IVF and pre-genetic diagnosis can have a great impact on the future of science, but immediately the price tag is something to consider. With almost $20,000 per treatment, only the wealthy would be able to afford this. This could lead to visually being able to see the elite class because they would be free of these undesirable traits, and only the middle to low class would have the undesirable traits. This will lead to preference for people without these traits and discrimination against people with these traits. If IVF and pre-genetic diagnosis is used to avoid undesirable traits, this will lead to a loss of diversity among humans, and it could also lead to discarding of embryos. Let's say that brown eyes is an undesirable trait. If doctors can screen and see brown eyes in an embryo, these embryos can be discarded, and this will lead to discarding embryos, and this could lead to an ethical and religious issue.
All right, thank you. A little small round of applause. Come on, Lauren. There we go. Demi, how did the group decide to include Liam's perspective into the overall presentation?
So Liam used the scientific lens in his paper, and this proved especially useful in presenting our stance in the presentation. By explaining how IVF works scientifically, we are given the vital information we need to come to a well-thought-out decision. We're able to dive deeper into exactly what goes on inside of the IVF, and Liam also talks about applications of IVF in science and how it can be used to avoid diseases and more. We use this vital information in the presentation to educate ourselves and others on how IVF impacts the science community and beyond.
Thank you. Gracie, give one specific way that your thinking changed as a result of learning about Aiden's findings.
Okay, so Aiden touched on the topic of IVF through the ethical lens, bringing different outlooks on the topic to our attention. He showed the different opinions people could have on the topic of IVF and if IVF is morally okay. With his research, it was brought to our attention that negative aspects of IVF, such as discarding the embryos, use of embryos, research and costs, which made myself contemplate if there should be laws and regulations put into place regarding specifically the leftover embryos versus IVF as a whole.
Okay, thank you. Liam, what's an example of a compelling argument from one of your peers' individual reports that you decided to exclude from the team presentation, and why did you decide to exclude it?
Okay, well, in Aiden's perspective, the ethical perspective, there were some kind of points that weren't properly researched. For example, some terms of designer babies, some forms of it, germline gene editing and CRISPR, also have some deeper kind of ethical issues in them. However, there's not enough research being done about that yet, and so because it's not being done yet, and as Aiden said, there's a lack of funding for these kind of things right now, it's not possible to see if there actually is an ethical issue, or whether or not these are just speculations of what might happen in the future.
Okay, thank you. Aiden, describe an argument from one of your peers' individual reports that made you think differently about your team's solution or conclusion.
I would say that Demi's futuristic lens, talking about how the cost of IVF in the future, really made me reconsider that, if IVF is going, obviously that we have to solve for people who are suffering from infertility as well as other issues that we pointed out. But because it's such a currently an expensive process, I was thinking about factoring in some sort of financial aspect towards our solution in order to make it a more equitable system, so that some of these traits don't only reside in poorer communities.
Okay, thank you. Another round of applause. Come on, Lauren. Let's just rip it up here. Nice and loud. All right, thank you, folks.